What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. The Villisca axe murders of 1912. What the killer left in the dark. 8 people went asleep on the night of June 9th, 1912. The youngest was 5 years old. The oldest was 43. They did not know they were being watched. They did not know the mirrors had already been covered. By morning, not one of them was breathing. The axe was still inside. The killer was already gone. And nobody in 112 years has ever been convicted. To understand how we arrived here, we need to go back. Consider, if you are willing, and I ask this not rhetorically but with the gravity of a warning, consider what it means for evil to have no origin. Not a disturbed man with a documented history. Not a grievance that can be located in a court record or a grudge traced to a specific evening. Consider instead the possibility that what entered the Moore house on the night of June 9th, 1912, was something that had been passing through the American interior long before Iowa was Iowa, long before the Nottoway River carved its path through that flat, indifferent farmland, long before the first white settlers broke the prairie soil and called it Montgomery County, and drew their grid lines over the dark earth as though geography could impose a human order upon what had lived there before them. The folklore of the Meskwaki people, who inhabited these lands for centuries before Montgomery County existed as a legal designation, spoke of presences that were not spirits in any sentimental sense, not the lingering consciousness of the dead seeking resolution or comfort. They spoke of something anterior to the human concept of intention, something that did not want, did not hate, did not plan. Something that simply moved through the world the way a current moves through water, purposeful only in the way mathematics is purposeful, which is to say, without consciousness, without mercy, and entirely without regard for the organisms caught within it. Dr. Nathaniel Ware, Professor of Indigenous American Studies, University of Iowa, 2009. The specific configuration of the Villisca crime scene, the covered mirrors, the precise arrangement of lamp oil, the sleeping positions of the victims left completely undisturbed, suggests a ritualistic framework that predates any European tradition investigators were equipped to recognize. They were searching for a human motive, in a scene that may not have been authored by anything operating within human frameworks. I do not present this as explanation. I present it as context, because before we can discuss what happened to the Moore family, before we can walk you through those 8 rooms in that 2-story house on East 2nd Street, we must first acknowledge what investigators in 1912 could not acknowledge, what they lacked the conceptual architecture to accommodate, the possibility that this crime was not committed by someone who had a reason. The possibility, and I ask you to hold this thought carefully, to resist the instinct to dismiss it, that something passed through Villisca, Iowa on the night of June 9th, as it had passed through other places in other years before and would pass through other places in the years to come, not choosing its victims, encountering them. The universe is older than you are. The darkness that predates your civilization does not require a motive. It requires only an open door, and on that night in Villisca, the door was open. The children were sleeping. The horror is older than the crime. It was here long before 1912, and what we are about to tell you happened to 8 people who had no reason to suspect that the world they trusted was, in one specific way, profoundly unreliable. But to understand what the darkness found when it arrived, we need to know who was inside that house. Josiah Moore was the kind of man who remembered your name, not in the politician way, not in the salesman way, in the genuine way, the way people in small Midwestern towns had in 1912 when a community of 2,500 actually functioned as a community. He'd grown up in Iowa, built his implement business from nothing, sold farm equipment to his neighbors at prices that kept them solvent rather than prices that made him rich. He was 43 years old. He had a good firm handshake. His hair was going gray at the temples. He coached his oldest son's baseball team when he could get away from the shop. Sarah Moore, 39, ran the house the way most women in Villisca ran their houses in 1912, absolutely, completely, and with a kind of cheerful competence that modern people have difficulty imagining because it was competence without a safety net. She grew her own vegetables. She canned her own preserves. She knew how to stretch a meal and how to make a birthday feel special on a tight budget, which is a skill that has never gotten the respect it deserves. She sang in the Presbyterian choir. She helped organize the Children's Day program at the church, the biggest social event of Villisca's year, the event that brought the whole town together in the summer heat for singing and performances, and the specific joyful chaos of children who have been given permission to show off. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the Moores had attended the Children's Day program. Their 4 children had performed. Herman, 11, and Mary Catherine, 9, had sung. Arthur, 7, and little Paul, 5, had been in the audience with their parents, barely able to sit still, the way 5-year-olds can't sit still when their siblings are on stage doing something that seems impossibly grown-up and wonderful. 2 of Mary Catherine's friends, Lena Stillinger, 12, and her younger sister Ine, 8, had been invited to sleep over. Their parents agreed. It was a Sunday. It was summer. The Children's Day program had gone wonderfully. They walked home together in the warm June evening, the whole family, the Stillinger girls trailing along, already half asleep on their feet. Josiah probably carried Paul part of the way. Sarah probably carried the folded programs the children had been given, the ones they'd want to keep. The sky over Villisca in June would have been enormous and indigo and scattered with more stars than any city person today would believe. And the town would have been mostly quiet, mostly dark, mostly at rest in the way that towns in 1912 went genuinely and completely to rest at night. No glowing screens, no distant highway noise, just the sound of the Nottoway River somewhere in the dark and the creak of porches and the occasional dog. They went inside, they went to bed. Sarah probably checked the doors. The first thing that doesn't fit comes 14 hours later. A neighbor named Mary Peckham looks out her window at 8 a.m. on Monday morning. The curtains in the Moore house haven't moved. Mary Peckham had been the Moores' neighbor for years. She knew Sarah's rhythms the way close neighbors know each other, not because they were intimate friends. Exactly, but because in a small town in 1912, with houses 30 feet apart and no sound insulation and windows you opened in June because it was the only air conditioning God had invented yet, you simply absorbed the patterns of the people next door. You knew when they woke up. You knew when the children went to school. You knew when the husband left for the shop. You knew the specific timbre of a household in the morning, the sounds and smells and movements that added up to a family being alive. The Moores were up by 6 every day. Sarah had 4 children to feed and a house to run. Josiah had a business to open. By 7 a.m., the Moore house would have been fully in motion, smoke from the kitchen, the sound of chairs, the specific percussion of a family getting through breakfast. Mary Peckham knew this without having been told it. She just knew it the way you know these things. At 8 a.m. on Monday, June 10, 1912, nothing in the Moore house had moved. The curtains were still. The smoke wasn't there. The sounds weren't there. The rhythms that 8 people living inside a house create, even sleeping people, even sleeping children, were absent. All of them, at once. Mary Peckham went to knock on the door. And here is the thing about that knock, the thing that King would want you to sit with for a moment. Because this is where the ordinary starts to crack. She knocked, and the sound of her knuckles against that door was the loudest sound in the entire neighborhood. Not because it was a loud knock, because the silence it knocked into was total. No footsteps inside, no voice calling out, no sound of a child waking, nothing. She tried the door. It was locked. She walked around the house. The cellar door was locked. The back door was locked. She looked in the windows and the curtains were drawn, all of them, every one. She went home and called the city marshal, Hank Horton. She told him something was wrong with the Moore house. She couldn't explain how she knew other than the silence. She was a practical woman. She didn't use words like dread or omen. She said, "Something is wrong over there." She was correct. She could not have imagined how correct she was. Hank Horton arrived at approximately 8:30 a.m. He tried the front door. He tried the back. He found an unlocked window and sent a neighbor through it. The neighbor unlocked the front door and pushed it open. Marshal Horton stepped inside. He would never speak about what he found for the rest of his life. Not once. Not to his wife. Not to anyone. When his daughter asked him about it 40 years later, he stood up and left the room. That was the second thing that didn't fit. Before we go inside, and we will go inside, all the way inside, we will walk every room, you need to understand something about the psychology of what Marshal Horton was stepping into. He was a small-town law enforcement officer in 1912. He had probably dealt with bar fights, maybe a theft or two, possibly a domestic dispute. Villisca's worst crime before June 10, 1912, was a disputed land title that got ugly in 1907. He was not equipped, no human being is equipped, for what the front door of the Moore house swung open to reveal. But he stepped inside anyway, because that is what you do. You rationalize. You tell yourself you're overreacting. You push down the animal alarm that is screaming at you, and you put one foot in front of the other, and you tell yourself you're a grown adult, and this is just a house, and there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this. He walked into the parlor. The drapes were drawn. In the half-dark, the room looked normal. Normal furniture, normal arrangement. Everything where it should be. The normalcy would have been almost reassuring. See, nothing's wrong. Mary Peckham got herself worked up over nothing. And he would have moved toward the stairs, telling himself a story about a family that had simply slept in, overslept after a late night, and would be embarrassed when the city marshal showed up in their parlor uninvited. And then he looked at the parlor mirror. It had been covered. Someone had taken a piece of cloth, a shirt. Investigators would later determine one of Josiah Moore's shirts, and draped it over the mirror so that no reflection was possible. The frame was still visible. The cloth had been arranged deliberately, carefully, tucked at the sides so it would stay in place. Horton looked at it, and his brain, the rational, procedure-following, everything has an explanation brain that had gotten him through 43 years of ordinary American life, offered him an explanation. People cover mirrors when there's a death in the house. It was a Victorian mourning custom, still practiced in rural America in 1912. Someone in the Moore family had died. That was it. That was the explanation. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt the tension ease. He didn't, because the other thing Victorian mourning customs required was someone alive to perform them. He moved toward the stairs. The first bedroom door was slightly open. He pushed it wider. The light that came through was the thin, gray light of a curtained room on a June morning. And in that light he could see that Sarah Moore was in the bed, not moving, not the way people don't move when they're sleeping, the other way. The wrong door. That's what King would call it. The choice that leads you deeper, past the point where turning back is still an option. Marshal Horton had made his wrong door choice the moment he told Mary Peckham he'd go check on it. Now he was inside the house, at the top of the stairs, and the only direction left was forward. He pushed open the master bedroom door. Josiah and Sarah Moore were in the bed. The bedclothes had been pulled up over them, tucked in, almost neatly, the way you might tuck in a sleeping child, and their faces were uncovered. This is the detail that destroys people when they first encounter the Villisca case, the detail that doesn't make sense and doesn't stop not making sense no matter how long you think about it. The killer had pulled the sheets up, over every victim, as though tucking them in for a long sleep. As though the act of violence required this specific courtesy at its conclusion. Josiah Moore had been struck at least 33 times. The medical examiner would later determine that the first blow had killed him, that everything after that was something other than murder, something that doesn't have a clean legal name. Sarah had been struck between 30 and 35 times. The axe had been a common implement, a roughly 4-pound, 2-bit axe found later in the house, the kind you could buy at any hardware store in Iowa in 1912. There was nothing special about it. There was nothing special about any of the physical objects involved in this crime. That is somehow the worst part. Horton backed out of the room. He went to the children's room. Herman, Mary Catherine. Arthur, Paul. He came back downstairs without looking in the mirror room. He walked out the front door. He stood on the porch of the Moore house in the June morning sunshine. In the warmth of the kind of summer day those children had been alive to enjoy the previous evening, and he did not speak for a long time. Mary Peckham was on her porch watching him. She asked, "How bad?" He said, "All of them." She asked, "The children too?" He didn't answer. He just walked to the street. By 9 a.m., the entire town of Villisca knew. By noon, there were 400 people standing outside the house. By the following morning, there would be reporters from Des Moines, from Kansas City, from Chicago. The Associated Press would wire the story to every newspaper in the country. The case would become the largest investigation in Iowa history. It would never be solved. And here is the part nobody talks about, the part left out of every news report, every official account, every interview. Because the people who knew, the ones who were actually there, made a decision. They decided some things were better left unsaid. They were wrong. And tonight, you're going to hear why. The house knew. It had known since before they went to sleep. The house had been telling them for 3 days. Houses lie. The neighbors said afterward that they had not noticed anything unusual in the days before. This is what neighbors always say. It is almost never entirely true. Emma and Albert Lindquist, who lived 2 houses east, said the Moore house had seemed quiet on Saturday, the 8th, quieter than usual. Mrs. Lindquist had waved to Sarah Moore in the yard, and Sarah had waved back. There had been nothing wrong with the wave. She could not explain why she had thought about that wave again later after. She just had. The children had played in the yard on Saturday afternoon. The children always played in the yard on Saturday afternoon. At some point they had gone inside earlier than usual. At some point the yard had gone quiet. Mrs. Lindquist could not say exactly when. She had been busy with her own work. She had not been paying particular attention. She mentioned it only because afterward, looking back, the early quiet seemed like it meant something. She couldn't say what. The back door of the Moore house had a habit of not latching properly. Sarah Moore had mentioned it to her husband in April. Josiah had said he'd fix it. He had not fixed it. This is not a metaphor. This is simply a fact about a door that, on the night of June 9th, 1912, did not latch properly and may or may not have been the way a person entered or exited. No one can say for certain. The investigators could not determine the point of entry with confidence. All exterior doors were locked from the inside when discovered. All windows were latched. There were no broken locks, no forced entries. The house was sealed from the inside. The house was sealed from the inside. This is the sentence investigators return to again and again. This is the sentence that does not resolve. This is the sentence you will find yourself turning over tonight in the dark after you've turned out the light, running your thumb along its edges looking for a seam, a way through it. A rational explanation that makes it lay flat and stay flat. You will not find one. The city marshal's examination of the downstairs found one additional covered mirror in the parlor, and one covered window, not curtained in the usual fashion, but covered with a piece of cloth that had been pinned in place. Someone had wanted the window dark. Someone had wanted no light coming in. Someone had wanted, specifically, that no one outside would be able to see inside. Not curtained, covered. The food on the second plate was still warm. This is what Jackson would say if she were writing this. Except in Villisca, the equivalently wrong detail was this. A 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon, taken from the Moore's own icebox, was found on the floor of the downstairs bedroom where the Stillinger girls slept. On the floor, not the kitchen, not the icebox. the floor of the bedroom where two little girls had been sleeping. Nobody at the investigation ever explained what it was doing there. Nobody ever satisfactorily answered the question of whether it arrived before the murders or after. Nobody has explained it yet. She noticed it on a Tuesday. 3 days later, it had a name in a police report. The town of Villisca responded to the murders the way small towns respond to catastrophic events, by gathering. By 10 a.m. on June 10th, there were hundreds of people in and around the Moore property. People who should have known better, and in a different era, a different century, would have known better walked through the house. The crime scene was compromised within hours of discovery. Footprints that might have been the killers were walked over. Objects that should not have been touched were touched. The deputy who was first assigned to secure the scene had never secured a crime scene in his life, because Villisca had never had a crime scene in his life, and he was completely, helplessly unprepared for the scale of what had happened in that house, and for the human instinct of every person in a small town to see it for themselves. Within 24 hours, souvenirs had been taken. This is documented. People removed objects from the Moore house and kept them. Small objects, a button from the parlor floor, a shard of plaster from a wall. Someone took the cloth that had covered a mirror. Why do people do this? Jackson would not try to answer the question. She would simply note it and let it sit. The Stillinger family, who had lost both of their daughters in the Moore house overnight, did not speak publicly. Inez, 8 years old, had apparently woken in the night and tried to fight her position when found. One arm partially raised, suggested she had been at least partially conscious when the axe fell. This is the fact that never leaves you. This is the one that comes back at 3 a.m. An 8-year-old girl in the dark, in a house that was not hers, far from her parents, frightened of something she could not see, reaching up in the dark with her small arm. The Moore's house stayed empty after the murders. No one rented it. No one bought it. For years it simply sat there on East 2nd Street, watching Villisca with its curtained windows, watching the neighbors who walked past quickly without turning their heads toward it, watching the town that never quite recovered from what had happened inside it. The grass grew long. The paint began to peel. The back door continued not to latch properly. Something had happened in that house. Something specific and terrible and human had happened in those 8 rooms. And something else, something that sat alongside the human explanation without quite fitting inside it, had also been present. The covered mirrors, the covered windows, the bacon on the floor, the locked house, the tucked sheets. The person who arranged those cloths over those mirrors knew exactly what they were keeping from seeing itself. What you just heard was only the beginning. The inquest was held on June 12, 1912, 2 days after the bodies were found. It was perfunctory. The Montgomery County coroner, a man named Dr. Cooper, presided over a proceeding that produced more questions than answers and resolved exactly none of them. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. That was the medical conclusion. Clean and simple and completely inadequate to describe what had actually happened in those bedrooms. The axe was displayed at the inquest. People looked at it. It was a plain axe, 2-pound striking head, 24-inch handle, the kind of axe kept in most Iowa households in 1912 for splitting firewood. It had been found in the downstairs bedroom, leaning against the wall near the Stillinger girl's bed, with what the report described as material consistent with the crime still present on the blade. No one at the inquest addressed the question of where the axe had come from. Whether it was the Moores' own axe, taken from their own woodpile and used against them in their own beds, or whether the killer had brought it to the house intentionally, and what either answer implied about the nature of what had happened. The axe was a prop. This is the quiet wrongness at the center of the Villisca case, the small wrongness that accumulates. The axe was a tool that was used, certainly, but the covered mirrors were not necessary for the use of an axe. The covered windows were not necessary. The tucked sheets were not necessary. The bacon on the floor of the children's room was not necessary. These elements spoke to something alongside the physical act of violence. They spoke to a person who had been inside that house for reasons that were not exclusively about killing 8 people. Someone who had arranged things. Someone who had been in no particular hurry. The kerosene lamps in the house had been turned down, not extinguished. Turned down to the lowest setting, as though by someone who needed just enough light to see by and did not want to work in total darkness. 2 of the lamps had been moved from their usual locations. The investigators noted this. They did not explain it. At the bottom of the investigators' report on Section 4 of the crime scene documentation, someone, whose handwriting does not match any of the named investigators, had written 4 words in the margin. The original report is held at the Iowa State Historical Society. The 4 words are still there. They say, "Who covered them first?" It is not a question. There is no question mark. It is a statement, and it is the one sentence in 60 pages of documentation that has never been attributed to a known author. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows when. June 10th, 1912, 9:14 a.m., Villisca, Iowa. Hank Horton, city marshal, filed his first report. 8 dead, all struck with a blunt implement. No suspects, no witnesses. Crime scene compromised by civilian entry. Signed, dated, filed. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was hired by the Iowa State Governor within 48 hours. Not the county sheriff, not Des Moines Police. The Pinkertons, private investigators, the most famous detective agency in America, the organization that had broken the Molly Maguires and hunted Jesse James. Hired for a small-town Iowa axe murder. This tells you something about the scale of what the state believed it was dealing with. James Wilkerson, Villisca, Iowa farmer, age 52, speaking to investigators July 1912. I heard nothing that night. My property borders the Moore lot on the north side. I'm a light sleeper. I have dogs. My dogs did not bark. This is the thing that I keep coming back to. My dogs do not fail to bark at a stranger. They did not bark, not once, not all night. James Wilkerson died in 1931. He is buried in Villisca City Cemetery. In an interview given to the Des Moines Register in 1928, 16 years after the murders, he said only that he had never bought another dog. When the reporter asked why, he said, "Because whatever was in that house that night, a dog can't do anything about it." The Pinkerton detective assigned to the case was a man named James Newton Wilkerson, different Wilkerson, who arrived in Villisca on June 14th and spent 11 months investigating before filing a 340-page report that the Iowa governor's office classified in 1913. That classification held for 31 years. When the report was finally released in 1944, 17 pages were missing. The pages missing were specifically pages 112 through 128, the section of the report dealing with what Wilkerson described in his table of contents as pre-event physical modifications to the Moore residence. The mirrors. He had written 17 pages about the mirrors. Those pages are gone. What the remaining 323 pages established was this. The murder weapon was confirmed as a common 2-pound axe. The estimated time of death was between midnight and 2 a.m. on June 10th. All 8 victims had been in deep sleep when struck. None of them had gotten out of bed or moved significantly from their sleeping positions, with the single exception of Ine Stillinger's partially raised arm. All bedclothes had been arranged over the victims after death. A cigar butt was found in a corner of the attic. The attic, not the main floor, suggesting the killer had spent time on the top floor of the house, possibly watching, possibly waiting before descending. The cigar had not been smoked in a hurry. It had been smoked to its full length slowly by someone sitting in the Moore's attic in the dark, waiting for 8 people to fall asleep below them. One last thing the Pinkerton report establishes. A keyhole on the interior side of the master bedroom door had been gouged deliberately, carefully gouged, so that no one inside the room could look through the keyhole and see into the hallway. From outside the room you could see in. From inside you could see nothing. The killer had wanted to be able to watch without being watched. October 1912. Investigation Month 4. The first named suspect was Frank Fernando Jones, state senator, former employer of Josiah Moore, resident of Villisca. He had a documented grudge. Moore had left his employment in 1908, taking several clients with him, and Jones had reportedly not recovered financially from the departure. More significantly, Jones had hired a private investigator named Bert Stillinger, no relation to the murdered girls, to conduct surveillance on Moore in the months before the murders. Stillinger confirmed this under oath. Surveillance for what purpose, Jones declined to specify. Jones was investigated for 3 years. He was never charged. The case against him dissolved not because he was cleared, but because the investigation was, in several specific and documentable ways, actively disrupted. Witnesses were paid. One witness, a traveling merchant who claimed to have seen a man matching Jones's physical description near the Moore house at 11 p.m. on June 9th, recanted his statement after receiving $2,000 in cash from a source he declined to name. In 1912, $2,000 was 3 years' wages for a Villisca factory worker. The merchant's name was Carl Carlson. He moved to California in 1913. He was never interviewed again. Reverend Amos Hendrickson, Presbyterian Church, Villisca, speaking to investigators, November 1912. Senator Jones sat in the third row at the Children's Day program on the evening of June 9th. He applauded when the Moore children performed. He shook hands with Josiah Moore at the conclusion of the evening. I saw them shake hands. I did not see anything in Jones's demeanor that concerned me at the time. Looking back, I don't know what I was looking at. But looking back, I am not certain that the man whose hand I shook at that program was entirely the man I had known. Reverend Hendrickson left Villisca in 1914. He did not give a reason for the departure in any documented source. The second major suspect was a traveling minister named Reverend George Washington Kelly. An itinerant preacher, Kelly had been in Villisca on June 9th specifically for the Children's Day program. He had delivered a sermon that evening. He had left Villisca on the first available train the following morning, the 5:17 a.m., before the bodies were discovered. His departure was not suspicious in itself. Traveling ministers moved frequently. But Kelly was known to investigators for other reasons. He had been investigated in 1909 in connection with a series of axe murders in Kansas, later determined to have been committed by a different suspect. He had a documented history of exhibitionism and what 1912 court documents delicately termed moral irregularity. He had no verifiable alibi for the hours between midnight and 5 a.m. on June 10th. And when interviewed in 1913, he said something to investigators that was recorded verbatim and has never been satisfactorily explained. He said, "I know what was in that house. I know because I have studied the type. The covered mirrors are specific to a very particular kind of individual, and that individual has left traces in other places before Villisca and has left traces since. I could give you names and locations and you would not believe me, so I will save us both the time." He then refused to say anything further without an attorney present, a right he was legally entitled to in 1912, even if investigators found it inconvenient. Kelly was arrested in 1917, charged with the Villisca murders on the basis of a confession he made during a religious revival meeting where he told his congregation that God had directed him to confess. He confessed in detail. 2 trials followed, 2 hung juries. He was acquitted in 1917. He died in 1930, having never spoken publicly about Villisca again. His confession has never been definitively proven. His innocence has never been definitively established. The case closed with no verdict. Not guilty, not innocent, just closed. The pattern, 1911-1912, United States. The Villisca murders did not happen in isolation. This is the fact that changes everything. This is the fact that the contemporary investigation failed to adequately pursue. and that subsequent researchers have documented thoroughly enough that its dismissal requires active effort. Between 1909 and 1912, a series of remarkably similar axe murders occurred across the American Midwest. Colorado Springs, Colorado, September 1911. The Burnham family, 6 killed, all in their beds, all covered with bedclothes, all struck with a similar implement. No suspects charged. Monmouth, Illinois, June 1912, 11 days before Villisca. The Dawson family, 5 killed, similar configuration, a piece of cloth found covering the bedroom mirror. Ellsworth, Kansas, March 1912, 4 killed, similar method. These cases were investigated separately, by separate jurisdictions, with no mechanism for coordination in 1912. The FBI would not exist for another 16 years. Cross-state investigation was functionally impossible. The murders were treated as isolated incidents because there was no institutional infrastructure to recognize a pattern. In 2014, researcher and author Susan Strauss completed a comparative analysis of 16 Midwestern axe murders between 1909 and 1912 and documented 12 consistent elements across 13 of the 16 cases. Covered mirrors or windows, victims left in sleeping position after death, a cigar or cigarette, an item of food removed from the kitchen and found displaced, no forced entry or entry method never determined. The analysis was presented at the University of Iowa's Criminology Department in 2015 and was the subject of a paper titled The Midwest Axe Murders, a case for serial pattern recognition in pre-FBI American crime investigation. Dr. Patricia Mayhew, criminal forensic psychologist, University of Iowa, 2015. The covered mirrors are the element that doesn't fit a purely functional motive. You don't cover mirrors to assist in a murder. You cover them because their reflections matter to you, because what a mirror can see, or what it can show you about yourself, is something you have a specific and persistent need to control. The identity of the Midwest axe murderer, if it was one individual, has never been established. The leading theory among modern researchers is a man known only from a partial description provided by a witness in the Ellsworth, Kansas case. Tall, traveling alone, carrying a grip bag, wearing a dark coat, observed near the Ellsworth crime scene the evening before the murders. He was described by 3 separate Ellsworth witnesses with consistent details. He was never identified. He was never found. He appeared in Villisca on June 9, 1912. He left on a train before dawn on June 10th. After 1912, the pattern of Midwest axe murders ceased, entirely, simultaneously, as though something had stopped or finished or simply moved on to something else. What I am about to tell you is documented. It is on record. It exists in files that are technically public but practically inaccessible. I found them. I read every page. You need to hear what is inside, because what happened once is still happening. The file ends there. What it cannot record is what happened inside every person in Villisca who read those documents, who walked past that house for the next 50 years. The specific weight of knowing that whatever came to East 2nd Street had been somewhere before and had been somewhere after, and nobody had been able to stop it, and nobody had seen it coming, and nobody even knew its name. Let's talk about the house. Let's talk about what happened to the house after 1912, because this is where King's horror lives, not in the event, but in the aftermath, in what the event does to the ordinary world around it, in the slow and relentless way that a genuinely terrible thing radiates outward through time. The Moore House at 508 East 2nd Street, Villisca, Iowa, was purchased by a businessman named J.H. Loomis in 1912, shortly after the murders. He may or may not have known the house's history. It seems inconceivable that any buyer in Villisca in 1912 did not know, but money has a way of resolving moral inconveniences. Loomis rented it out. The first tenants moved in and moved out within a month. The second tenants lasted 6 weeks. The third family, a couple with 2 children, names not recorded, lasted 3 months before the husband filed a statement with the county clerk's office that is still accessible in Montgomery County historical records. The statement is brief. It says the family is vacating the property due to continued disturbances of a nature that cannot be attributed to natural causes. It does not elaborate. The county clerk of the time noted in his own handwriting beside the filing, the fourth such complaint from this property. Fourth such complaint. There had been 3 before, not publicly circulated, presumably filed and quietly noted and just as quietly ignored. Because what do you do with a complaint like that? What legal mechanism exists for the house is wrong? People in Villisca stopped walking past the Moore house at night by the mid-1920s. This is not legend, not ghost story embellishment. This is documented in the oral histories collected by the Montgomery County Historical Society between 1965 and 1970, when surviving elderly residents of Villisca were interviewed about their memories of the town in the first half of the century. Interview after interview contains the same detail. At night, you crossed the street when you got to the Moore house. You didn't look at the windows. You got past it and then you didn't think about it anymore. Not because you believed in ghosts, necessarily. Because something in the part of you that predates rational thought told you that the geometry of that house was wrong. That the space it occupied had been changed by what happened inside it. That the darkness behind those curtained windows was a different quality of dark. Now here is what King would want you to understand about this. That response, that crossing the street, that not looking was not weakness. It was not superstition. It was the rational mind's acknowledgement in the only way it knows how that some events leave marks on the world that don't fade just because time has passed. You can renovate a house. You can repaint its walls. You can bring in new furniture and new people and flood it with light. You cannot change what happened in its rooms. The past is not gone. It's not even past, as someone once said. And in the Moore house on East 2nd Street, the past was 8 people who went to sleep and didn't wake up, and something that moved through those rooms in the dark, unhurried, arranged things to its satisfaction, and left before dawn. They discovered that night that there was no leaving. They would carry this house inside them for the rest of their lives. Every single person who had ever gone inside it. In 1994, the Moore house was purchased by Darwin and Martha Lynn, who recognized it as a significant piece of Iowa history and began the process of restoring it as a historic site. They furnished it as closely as possible to its 1912 configuration. They installed a museum-quality exhibit explaining the murders, the investigation, the suspects. They opened it to tour. This was, in its way, an act of courage, an act of looking directly at the worst thing and refusing to let it be simply hidden or forgotten. The Lynns are not monster hunters. They are not thrill seekers. They are people who believe that history, especially the kind of history that is uncomfortable and unresolved and refuses to lay flat, deserves to be preserved and examined rather than quietly erased. They did good work, important work. The paranormal investigators started coming almost immediately. This is where King would give you your false relief. Look, the house is open. People are inside it with flashlights and audio recorders and all their rational 21st century equipment. And nothing is happening. And it's fine, it's just a house. It's a historic site now. They charge $12 for a daytime tour and $80 for an overnight investigation. And it's all very organized and scheduled and controlled. On November 7th, 2014, a paranormal investigator named Robert Lawson was conducting an overnight investigation in the upstairs bedroom, the bedroom where the Moore children had slept. He was alone in the room. His audio recorder was running. His video camera was running. At 2:17 a.m., both devices recorded the same sound simultaneously, a prolonged, rhythmic knocking from inside the wall of the room, not pipes. The building's plumbing had been updated in the 1970s, not the house settling. The knocking was rhythmic, a consistent pattern, 8 beats, then silence, then 8 beats again. 8 beats, 8 people. Lawson left the room immediately and did not return. His footage is publicly accessible on YouTube and has been viewed over 4 million times. Audio engineers who have analyzed the recording cannot identify a natural source for the sound. That is one account. There are, as of 2024, over 230 documented accounts of paranormal encounters in the Moore house. Not one of them has been definitively explained. But here is what nobody talks about. Here is what every tour guide in that house knows and does not mention to the daytime visitors. Here is what happens reliably, consistently, without exception, to the mirror in the downstairs parlor. The one that faces the staircase. The one that the killer covered before the murders. It does not stay covered. The coverings slide, always at night, always when no one is watching. The fabric, whatever fabric is used, ends up on the floor. And in the morning, when the first person comes in, the mirror is uncovered. The mirror is always uncovered, and it is always reflecting the staircase. This is the moment in King's stories where the monster is finally partially visible. Not fully. King knows better than to give you everything at once. He gives you enough to understand the shape of what you're dealing with, and then he stops, because what your imagination constructs from that partial image will always be worse than anything he could describe completely. So here is the partial image. Here is the shape of what was in that house. It was patient. This is the defining characteristic of whatever planned and executed the Villisca murders, and it is the characteristic that most defies the framework of impulsive violence. It arrived at the Moore house and did not act immediately. It went to the attic. It sat in the attic in the dark, smoking a cigar that it smoked to its full length, while 8 people went about the last ordinary hours of their lives below. It heard the family come home from the children's day program. It heard the children being settled into bed. It heard the house go quiet. It waited. It waited until the stillness below was the specific deep stillness of a house where everyone is in deep sleep. It waited probably another hour after that, just to be certain. Then it came down from the attic. And this is the detail that I want you to sit with, the detail that has been described to me by every investigator and researcher who has spent serious time with this case as the single element they cannot process and put down. It covered the mirrors before it went to the bedrooms. It moved through the darkened house, a house it had never been inside before this night, and found the mirrors and covered them, all of them, before it went upstairs. There are 2 possible explanations for this. The first is superstition, a genuine belief in the killer's psychology that a mirror could capture something, reveal something, remember something in a way that posed a specific danger. This is an ancient belief, present in multiple cultural traditions, and a person genuinely operating from this belief system would cover mirrors with the focused practicality of someone performing a necessary safety measure. The second explanation is worse. The second explanation is that the killer covered the mirrors because it did not want to see itself. That whatever it was, whatever it had become in whatever years of whatever life had brought it to that attic in Villisca, it knew what its own reflection contained, and it could not bear to look at it while it did what it came there to do. A man who cannot look at himself in a mirror while he kills 8 people in their sleep is not the most frightening thing in this story. The most frightening thing is that we have never found him. And he covered the mirrors in other houses, before and after, in other towns, in other states, and nobody. What you just heard was only the beginning. The thing about King's horror, the thing that separates it from cheaper thrills, is that it always comes back to people, to specific, real, breathing people and what the darkness does to them. Not just the victims, the survivors, the investigators, the neighbors who crossed the street, the children of those neighbors who grew up hearing the name Villisca spoken in a particular tone of voice and understood without being told that it meant something that adults didn't talk about directly. Consider the investigators. Consider what it means to spend years inside a case that cannot be solved, to read those files over and over, to interview witnesses who say the same unsettling things in the same unsettled voices, to walk through that house on East 2nd Street in the evening when the tour groups have left, and the building is quiet, and the light is fading, and the parlor mirror is reflecting the staircase again. The staircase where, if you stand and think about it, the killer would have descended at 2 a.m. on June 10th. Moving from the upstairs bedrooms back to the ground floor, axe in hand, finished. Consider James Newton Wilkerson, the Pinkerton detective, who spent 11 months in Villisca and wrote 340 pages about what he found, 17 pages of which were about the mirrors. 17 pages, which means he had enough to say about the covered mirrors to fill 17 pages of a detective's report, and we will never know what those pages contained because they were removed from the file between 1913 and 1944. Someone read Wilkerson's 17 pages about the mirrors and decided they should not be preserved. Think about that decision. Think about whoever made it. What did Wilkerson say in those pages that someone found more dangerous than the rest of the 323 pages they left intact? And consider the last normal thought of every person who became deeply involved with this case, the specific moment when they understood that there was no clean ending, no verdict, no final document that would close the file and let them sleep. When Hank Horton walked out of that house on the morning of June 10th and stood on the porch and didn't speak. When the jurors in the second Kelly trial walked out of the courthouse in 1917, unable to agree on a verdict. When the researchers who have come to Villisca in the century since and left without answers. The shared experience of standing at the center of something terrible and undeniable and utterly unresolved. There is no exit from this. There was never an exit. That is the last ordinary thought they will ever have about the Villisca case. The moment they realize they will be carrying it for the rest of their lives, as every person who has ever looked at it too closely has carried it, not as a solved mystery, but as an open wound that time has not closed. That was the last ordinary thought he would ever have. I do not use the word ordinary lightly. I use it the way one might use the word sure, while watching it disappear behind you in the fog. And now, the mind turns inward, as it must, as it always does eventually, when the external evidence yields no answer, when the file closes without a verdict, when the research roads terminate in silence and sealed pages. The rational investigation fails. What remains is the investigation that happens inside the skull of every person who has looked too long at this case, the particular psychological topography of an obsession that has no end. I confess, yes, I use that word deliberately. I use it because it is the accurate word. I confess that the Villisca case does something to the mind that studies it. Not immediately, not on the first reading. On the first reading, it is terrible and fascinating and incomprehensible in the way that documented evil is always incomprehensible. But the mind is still navigating it. The mind is still oriented. There is still a compass that points, however unsteadily, toward rationality. But the covered mirrors will not, I have tried, they will not settle into any framework I have constructed. I return to them. I find myself returning to them at hours of the night when I should be occupied with other thoughts. At 2 a.m., which is the specific hour of the Moore killings, I have found myself standing in the dark and asking aloud to no one, why the mirrors? What could a mirror show you? What did he fear seeing there? Was it his own face, distorted by what he was about to do? Was it the reflection of the children in their beds? Was it something else entirely? Something that he, in his framework, believed capable of looking back through the glass? Is that madness? Is it madness to ask these questions at 2 a.m. in the dark? I know what you are thinking. I have been told it before. You are thinking, this is a rational person losing their rational perspective under the pressure of material that exceeds what rational perspectives are built to contain. You are thinking, step back. You are thinking, get some sleep. But the locked house with all doors sealed from the inside. How does a person enter a locked house and leave a locked house and leave it locked behind them from the outside without a key? The investigators could not answer this. The Pinkerton agency could not answer this. 112 years of investigation has not answered this. Either there is an answer that has not yet been found, a hidden passage, an unlocked window that was later locked by someone who entered and found the bodies. Or the locked house is what it appears to be, a sealed room from which no one should have been able to exit. Was that real? Was the door actually locked? Could a door locked from the outside look, on examination, identical to a door locked from the inside? The answer is yes, under certain specific conditions, but only if someone with a key exists who has never been identified and who locked the door from outside after completing the work inside. And if that person exists, they had a key to the Moore house. They had a key, which means they had been there before, had obtained a key before that night, had planned this entrance far enough in advance to have a key made. The question I cannot answer about myself. At what point did I stop studying this case and start being inside it? The mirrors, again the mirrors, always the mirrors. Every road in this investigation returns to the covered mirrors, and I have found in my research something that the mainstream investigations have never adequately addressed, something buried in a folklorist's monograph from 1889, published in a small circulation journal out of Philadelphia, titled "On the Superstitious Functions of Mirror Covering Among Certain Rural American Sects." The author, a man named R.H. Calthorpe, whose subsequent publications I have been unable to locate, who may have published under other names or who may have published nothing further, documents 17 separate American communities in the period 1840 to 1889, where the practice of covering mirrors was associated not with mourning, as we commonly understand it, but with something else entirely, with what Calthorpe called the sealing of witness. The belief, and it was a genuine belief, practiced seriously, with theological justification in at least 3 of the communities he documents, was that a mirror in the presence of violent death would record the event, would retain in its glass some imprint of what it had witnessed, would, if left uncovered, show that imprint to those who looked into it later. You are perhaps skeptical, as you should be, as I was, but Calthorpe's monograph includes a detail that I have not been able to dismiss. He documents, in his account of a community in rural Kentucky in 1871, a case in which a covered mirror was uncovered by investigators and discovered to show, in its reflection, not the reflection of the investigators standing before it, but an image that 2 of the 3 investigators present described as a room that was not the room they were standing in which several shapes were visible that could not be definitively identified, but which were unanimously described by both investigators as horizontal, prone, covered. I do not know if this is true. I cannot verify it. I report it as I found it, because this is what this investigation has reduced me to. Reporting what I cannot verify because the verified record is insufficient. If you are still with me, if you have not yet turned away, write in the comments below. The mirrors remember. Let me know I am not alone in this. Let me know that others have come this far into this case and found, as I have found, that the rational framework bends under its weight. Let me know the darkness is not only in my study at 2 a.m. Let me know. Because what I am about to describe, the full account of what Calthorpe found in his final documented case in a community in central Iowa in 1897, is something I have been circling for days. It is something I am not certain I should tell you. It is something that, once told, cannot be untold. And what frightens me is not the account itself, which is terrible enough, but the location. The location of Calthorpe's 1897 Iowa case. He does not name the town. He describes it as a small farming community on the Nottoway River. There is only one small farming community on the Nottoway River. Villisca, it was Villisca, 1897. 15 years before the murders, yes, 15 years exactly, a community on the Nottoway River, a farmhouse on the eastern edge of town, a family whose name Calthorpe withholds but describes as well-regarded, prosperous, known for their generosity. A night in October. An unusual event, which Calthorpe declines to describe fully, referring to it only as an episode of violent communal psychosis of brief duration, the participants of which could not, upon recovery of their faculties, account for their actions. Several mirrors in the farmhouse had been covered before the episode, not by the family. They denied covering them. Neighbors who had been present during the episode confirmed they had not covered the mirrors. The mirrors were simply covered. When investigators arrived the following morning, every mirror in the house was covered with items of clothing belonging to the male head of the household. The family moved away from Villisca by the end of 1897. The farmhouse was demolished in 1901. The site is currently, I have checked the county records, the site is currently a residential lot on East 2nd Street. The specific address is not the Moore House. It is the lot adjacent to the Moore House. Does this mean anything? Does it mean the ground itself carries something? That whatever ritual or psychosis or compulsion or visitation, call it what you will, that precipitated the covering of mirrors in Villisca in 1897 was connected, 15 years later, to the same act performed in the same town by a killer who may or may not have ever been to Villisca before that night? I do not know. I know only that I have been inside this case for longer than I should have been. I know that I returned to the covered mirrors. I know that I have begun at night, without quite deciding to check my own mirror before sleeping, to check that it is uncovered, to check that nothing in it is showing something it should not show. I know that last Tuesday I checked the mirror in my bathroom at 2 a.m. and what I saw in it was myself, only myself, looking back. But the angle was wrong. The angle of my reflection was. But do not for one moment believe that you are simply listening to a story. What I am telling you is real. It has always been real. And the reason I know this, the reason I cannot stop, is that it is still happening. Right now, as I speak these words to you in the dark. And so my mind, what remained of it, turned at last to the question I had been circling for days. Not what had I seen in the mirror, but what precisely had seen me back. Let us, and I recognize that this transition requires of the listener a particular willingness to follow the argument to its logical terminus, regardless of how uncomfortable that terminus may prove. Let us consider, with whatever cold academic clarity we can still muster at this stage of the investigation, the possibility that the Villisca murders are not a crime story. That the framework of crime, perpetrator, motive, method, evidence, is simply the wrong framework. That we have been attempting to force a phenomenon that exists at a scale far exceeding the human into the entirely human scale of a county court case, a police report, a jury deliberation. That the covered mirrors, the unforced entry into a sealed house, the pattern of identical events across multiple states over multiple years conducted, potentially, by multiple individuals with no known connection to one another. That these elements cannot be made to fit inside the human framework no matter how aggressively we press them, because they were never meant to fit there. Dr. Francis Albrecht, Chair of Comparative Mythology, Harvard University, 1978, in a privately circulated paper titled Cyclical Violence and Pre-Rational Symbolism in Midwest American Crime Clusters, 1895-1915. What the anthropological record suggests, and I acknowledge this is deeply speculative territory for an academic paper, is that the specific behavioral signatures present across the documented Midwest axe murders bear a closer resemblance to documented ritual behaviors associated with pre-contact North American belief systems regarding the barrier between the living and the dead than to any known psychological profile for a human serial offender. The mirrors, the food displacement, the careful arrangement of the deceased, these are not the behaviors of a disturbed individual acting from personal pathology. These are the behaviors of someone, or several someones, performing a ceremony they believe to be necessary for reasons that may not be accessible to rational interpretation. Albrecht's paper was never formally published. He submitted it to 3 journals, all of which declined without explanation. The copy I am working from was obtained from the Harvard University archive under a Freedom of Information request that took 3 years to fulfill. The paper exists in one physical copy. The digital scan I possess is, as far as I am aware, the only other copy in circulation. The ceremony. If it was a ceremony, and I do not commit to this interpretation, I present it only because it is the interpretation that accommodates the most evidence with the fewest contradictions. Then the question it raises is not who performed it, but why. What did the covered mirrors accomplish in the belief system of whoever arranged them? What barrier were they sealing, and what were they sealing it against? And if that barrier was real, if the thing being sealed against was real, what was it? The Meskwaki have a word. I will not reproduce it here because its reproduction in written form carries in Meskwaki tradition specific prohibitions, but it translates approximately as the thing that moves through sleeping places, not the thing that kills in sleeping places, the thing that moves through them, as though the killing is incidental, as though the violence is not the purpose, but the residue of something else happening in those rooms while the household sleeps, something that requires darkness, requires sealed mirrors, requires the removal of anything that might record or witness or reflect. What I am suggesting is that the Villisca murders may have been a side effect, that 8 people died not because they were the target, but because they were present in a space that was being used for something else entirely. The realization that this changes nothing, that understanding the nature of the evil cannot protect the sleeping, is the specific realization that human language was not designed to carry. I must attempt, with the full awareness of the inadequacy of language for this purpose, to describe what the deepest research into the Villisca case eventually suggests about the nature of the presence in that house. Not the killer, not the human agency, if human agency was present. The other thing. The thing that Calthorpe's 1897 report documented in the house adjacent to the later Moore property. The thing that the Meskwaki named and refused to name. The thing that the covered mirrors were intended to contain, or seal, or, here language fails in a specific and predictable way, to keep from seeing. It does not operate at a human scale. This is the first and most essential thing to understand, and it is the thing that every investigator, researcher, and witness who has come close to it has ultimately failed to adequately communicate, because the concept requires a cognitive framework that human evolution has not equipped us to generate natively. We experience time as sequential. We experience space as dimensional. We experience consciousness as interior, private, bounded by skull and skin. The thing that moves through sleeping places operates within none of these frameworks. It does not move through time sequentially. It does not experience space as we experience space. It does not have an interior, or it is entirely interior, which is a paradox that the rational mind cannot hold without breaking. The covered mirrors. What Calthorpe's Foley-Wrist tradition suggests, what the Meskwaki oral records suggest, what the behavioral signatures across 16 documented crime scenes from 1909 to 1912 collectively suggest, is this. A mirror in the presence of this thing does not reflect. It records. It retains an impression of the thing in a way that other surfaces do not. The cloth over the mirror is not superstition. It is a practical measure taken by something that understood at some level that the glass would hold its image, and that its image was not, could not be, something it was willing to leave behind. What does it look like? I will not answer that question, not because I am being coy, not because I am protecting a dramatic reveal, because the accounts from the 1897 Villisca incident, from the 3 investigators who uncovered the mirror in the Kentucky case of 1871, from 2 of the surviving members of the households that experienced what Albrecht called the cyclical violence pattern. These accounts, when they attempt physical description, do not describe a form. They describe the failure of form. They describe something that the visual cortex cannot process correctly, that the brain's pattern recognition systems receive and immediately reprocess into something more tolerable, something that the conscious mind can survive encountering. What reaches conscious awareness is not what was actually seen. What reaches conscious awareness is the brain's best available substitution for something it was not built to contain. All these witnesses agreed on one thing, not what it looked like, what it felt like to be near it. They all used the same word, not terror, not dread, something quieter than either. Recognition. There is a man named Thomas Hennessy. He is, or was, as of the last verified contact, a retired archivist who spent 31 years at the Iowa State Historical Society before his early retirement in 2009 at the age of 52. His retirement was not voluntary, by the most reliable accounts available, though the official documentation describes it as such. He had been, in the final 3 years of his tenure, the primary caretaker of the Montgomery County historical records that include the Villisca investigation materials. In 2007, Hennessy submitted a formal request to the State Archives Board to have a specific collection of materials, a collection he described only as supplementary to the 1912 Montgomery County crime investigation, reclassified as restricted access. The request was denied on procedural grounds. He submitted it a second time in 2008, denied again. He retired in 2009. The supplementary collection he requested to have restricted remains cataloged under its original designation, but has not been accessed by any verified researcher since 2007. The catalog listing exists. The physical materials are listed as present storage location revised. The revised storage location is not documented in any public record. I contacted Hennessy through his former colleague in 2022. He agreed to a telephone conversation on the condition that I did not record it. I agreed. I am reproducing here, from memory and contemporaneous written notes, the relevant portion of our conversation. He said, "There are 17 pages missing from the Wilkerson report. You probably know that. What you don't know is that those 17 pages weren't removed from the file. They were filed separately. They were filed separately because whoever reviewed them in 1913 decided they should not be part of the main record. I read them in 2006. I read them twice. I applied to have the collection restricted after the second reading. I asked him what was in those 17 pages. There was a long silence on the telephone. I counted 11 seconds. He said, Wilkerson documented what the mirrors showed after the murders, before they were covered again. What the mirrors in the Moore house were showing in the 72 hours after the bodies were discovered, before the house was finally sealed. He went back with a photographer. The photographs were in the collection. The photographs were part of what I applied to have restricted. I asked him what the photographs showed. He said, Wilkerson's notes describe 8 photographs, one for each mirror in the house. He describes what each mirror was reflecting at the time each photograph was taken. I won't describe those descriptions to you. I will tell you that the photographer who took those photographs, a man named Carl Devaney of Des Moines, was admitted to the Iowa Hospital for the Insane on September 3, 1912. He remained a patient there until his death in 1937. He produced no further photographic work after June 1912. His commitment papers, which I have also read, contain one statement attributed to him that is relevant. He said, the mirrors in that house were not showing the rooms. They were showing where the rooms had been. The photographs still exist. Thomas Hennessy knows where they are. He has not told anyone, and he told me at the end of our conversation that he intended to keep it that way, because Wilkerson's report described something in those mirrors that was, in his words, the words of a trained Pinkerton investigator writing formally in 1912, not yet finished with what it had come to that house to do. Not yet finished. What you just heard was only the beginning. The photographs exist. The 17 pages exist. The pattern across 16 crime scenes in 4 states exists, documented and cross-referenced by researchers who have dedicated years to assembling what no single 1912 investigator could have assembled. The 1897 Villisca incident exists, documented by Calthorpe and corroborated, in its essentials, by two separate oral histories collected by the Montgomery County Historical Society in 1967. Thomas Hennessy exists. His testimony, unrecorded but rendered here faithfully, exists. What does not exist, what cannot be made to exist, regardless of the quality or quantity of investigation, is an answer that fits inside the framework of human crime. A human perpetrator with a human motive who performed a human act. The Moore case has been investigated by the Pinkerton Agency, the Iowa Bureau of Investigation, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, multiple private researchers over the course of a century, two nationally broadcast television investigations, one academic peer-reviewed study, and the combined attention of every true crime podcast, forum, and documentary series that has addressed it in the last 20 years. It has not been solved. It has not been solved not because the investigation has been insufficient. It has not been solved because it may not be, in any conventional sense, solvable. Because the question it poses is not, who did this, but something the human legal system has no procedure for addressing. Something the human mind was not designed, in its evolutionary history, to hold as a sustained inquiry without cost. The cost, in the case of every person who has looked at this case for long enough, Horton, Wilkerson, the photographer Devaney, Hennessy, the researchers who have published and the researchers who have stopped publishing, is consistent and predictable, and has been noted independently by multiple people who had no contact with one another. The cost is the specific experience of looking at something that looks back, of studying a darkness that, at some threshold of sustained attention, begins to study you in return. What has been described thus far represents only the outermost fragment of the truth, the portion that human language can approximate. What lies beneath that layer, what the deepest accounts suggest, is something for which no preparation is adequate. Nothing that follows can be unheard. You were warned. And so the mind turns inward once more. What remained of it? Turns to the question of what the obsession has cost. Turns to the specific, personal reckoning of looking too long into the abyss of East 2nd Street and finding not the abyss looking back exactly. Finding something that had already been there, inside the skull, waiting to be seen. I checked the mirror last night. I checked it, yes, at 2 a.m. as I have checked it every night for weeks now. You will judge this. You will say, he has allowed himself to be consumed. He has crossed from investigation into compulsion. He has confused the horror he is studying with the horror inside himself. But here is what you do not understand, what you cannot understand from outside this case. The crossing happened without my knowledge. There was no single moment, no threshold I knowingly stepped across. There was only the accumulating weight of the mirrors, the locked doors, the covered windows, the 17 missing pages, the photographer who never worked again, all of it pressing on the mind's structure until the structure began, by degrees so small as to be imperceptible to change. I am not the first. I am not the second. I am not among the first 100. Every person who has spent real time inside the Villisca case arrives at this place, this specific intersection of investigation and obsession, where the professional distance they brought to the material has been consumed entirely, where the material has become personal in ways they did not invite and cannot now uninvite. Horton, who would not speak of it for the rest of his life. Wilkerson, who wrote 17 pages about mirrors, and then, based on Hennessy's account, documented what the mirrors were showing in the aftermath. What kind of man writes those pages and remains intact? Devaney, the photographer committed to an asylum, all his subsequent testimony reduced to that single line. The mirrors were showing where the rooms had been. What is the line? I keep returning to this question with the specific desperation of a person who knows they have already crossed it. What is the line between a researcher who studies obsessively and a person who has been? The word is uncomfortable, but it is accurate claim. by the material, by the case, by whatever it is that the case contains in those sealed rooms and covered mirrors and missing photographs that continues to reach outward into the minds of everyone who approaches it closely enough. I believe I crossed it the night I covered my own mirror. I did not intend to cover it. I was standing in the bathroom at 2 a.m., as I have described, as has become my habit as I cannot seem to prevent, and I had taken a towel from the rack, intending to use it, and I had instead, without deciding to, without any conscious intention that I can reconstruct, draped it over the glass, arranged it at the sides so it would stay. When I understood what I had done, I stood in the bathroom for a long time. I asked myself why. The answer that presented itself was not one I had constructed. It arrived fully formed from somewhere below conscious thought, with the authority of something that had been waiting to be articulated for weeks. I covered the mirror because I did not want it to see what I had become. What I have become, I say this with the clarity of a person describing a chemical process, a dissolution, an irreversible phase change. What I have become is a person who cannot be in a room with an uncovered mirror after midnight, who has checked the Villisca crime scene photographs so many times that I have memorized the position of every victim, can reconstruct each room from memory, can tell you where the Moor's axe was kept before that night and where it was found after, who has read Wilkerson's 323 remaining pages 11 times and found 11 new things I had not noticed on previous readings, who has corresponded with Thomas Hennessy on 4 subsequent occasions, each conversation shorter, each one ending with him saying some variation of the same thing. You should stop. You should stop looking at this. Not because there's nothing to find, because of what finding it does to the finder. I have not stopped. I cannot stop. And this is the specific psychological truth that the Villisca case illuminates about the human mind's relationship with unresolvable horror. It is not the resolution that drives the obsession. It is the absence of it. The case without a verdict becomes a door that cannot be closed. You stand in front of it your entire life, pressing, finding it immovable, and the pressing becomes the purpose. The pressing becomes the person. Guilt is the word Poe would use here, and he would be correct. Not guilt for the crime. I did not commit any crime in Villisca in 1912, but guilt for looking. For the specific prurience of deep engagement with 8 people's violent deaths, of reading medical examiner reports that describe what an axe does to a sleeping child's skull, of examining crime scene photographs with the attention a scholar gives a primary text, of incorporating this horror into my intellectual life as though it were a subject like any other subject, as though proximity to it were without cost. The cost is not metaphysical. It is not punishment from beyond. The cost is simply this. You cannot look at something for long enough without beginning to see it when you're not looking. I see the Moore house when I close my eyes. I see it at the specific gray light quality of pre-dawn June in Iowa, 4:30 a.m., the birds not yet up, the street empty, the house with its curtained windows and its covered mirrors and its 8 bodies arranged in their beds under their neatly tucked sheets. And in the attic, always in the attic, something that has finished what it came to do and is waiting with perfect patience for the light to change. I have become a person who lives adjacent to that house, who will always live adjacent to that house. The line was crossed and I did not feel it cross. That is what this case does. That is the specific damage it inflicts on the minds that study it. Not terror, something quieter. It moves in and then it simply stays. There is one thing I have not said. One piece of information I recognize the word avoiding. Circling, the way you circle a drain. I have been aware of it since section 17 of this account, and I have allowed the surrounding material to carry me past it, over it, around it. While it sat in the center of everything I was saying, visible but unaddressed, the way a bruise sits under clothing, present, painful, and concealed by habit. In 2019, the current owners of the Moore house, and I will not name them here, because they have not given me permission to do so, and because they deserve what privacy this case allows, made a structural modification to the building. A routine renovation of the attic space. in the process of removing a section of original 1910 flooring from the attic, the same attic floor on which the unknown person sat and smoked a cigar to its full length on the night of June 9th, 1912. They found, beneath the floorboards, in the gap between the floor and the ceiling of the room below, a sealed tin box. Inside the tin box, two items. The first was a photograph, an old photograph glass plate format consistent with photographic technology available in 1912. The photograph depicted the interior of a room, the Moore's master bedroom, recognizable from its configuration, taken from an angle consistent with a person standing in the doorway, taken based on the quality and characteristics of the image as assessed by a photographic historian contacted by the owners, taken at night. In the dark bedroom, showing what the room contained. The second item was a piece of cloth, folded carefully, stained in a manner consistent with age and with contact with a flat glass surface, a piece of mirror-covering cloth. Neither item has been submitted to law enforcement. The owners did not report the discovery publicly. They told one person, who told two people, and the information reached me through a chain of contact I will not trace in this account for reasons of protecting the sources who trusted me with it. I have not seen the photograph. I cannot confirm what it shows. What I was told it shows, and I present this with the full weight of its implications for the listener to assess, is the master bedroom of the Moore house, at night, occupied, with something in it that is not the Moore family. I have been asked more than once to describe the angle of my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The question I have been asked, and have declined to answer, is this: does the figure I see in the mirror at 2 a.m. sometimes appear to be standing slightly behind where I am standing? The single sentence I have been avoiding: yes, yes it does. Enough of the theoretical, enough of the psychological architecture of obsession, enough of what the darkness does to the mind that studies it. What was found in that house deserves to be described as it was, in full, in light, with nothing hidden. The door is open, the light is on. Here is what the axe does to a sleeping human body. Here is what the medical examiner found, and what the photographs documented, and what the inquest record describes in the precise, deliberate language of forensic medicine, trying to contain something that forensic language was not built to contain. Josiah Moore was a large man, broad-shouldered, 43 years old, in good physical health from years of physical work. The first blow was delivered while he slept on his right side, facing away from the bedroom door. The angle of the strike was downward and slightly lateral, the work of someone standing above and to the left, someone who had approached the bed in complete darkness and positioned themselves with what the medical examiner described as some care as to placement, not a frenzied attack. A considered one. The first blow was sufficient. This is the fact that the medical examiner stated clearly. Josiah Moore would not have survived the first strike, and everything that followed, the additional 32 verified impact marks on skull and facial structure, was performed on a body already dead. Why 33 strikes? Why not one and done, which was sufficient for the purpose? What drove the continuation, the persistence, the specific application of force to a skull that had long since ceased to offer anything a living person could fear or feel? This is the question that Barker would ask without flinching, because Barker understood that the worst horrors are not the ones that happen in the dark, but the ones that reveal something true about the capacity for violence in the human animal, or in whatever animal walks upright and uses an axe. Not madness, not passion, something worse than both, something methodical. Sarah Moore had been sleeping beside her husband. She had not escaped the bed. She had not, the evidence suggests, wakened before the first blow, no defensive injuries, no blood under her fingernails from gripping anything, no indication of struggle. She had been alive, and then, between one moment and the next, she had not been. 33 strikes to Josiah, between 30 and 35 to Sarah. The numbers are consistent. The numbers suggest not escalating frenzy, but something that looked, in the pattern of its application, like a process being completed, a necessary quantity of work. The children's room. Herman 11, Mary Catherine 9, Arthur 7, Paul 5. In their beds, in their shared room with their shared childhood history and their specific individual faces and the small personal objects on their respective nightstands that the crime scene photographs also document. A baseball card belonging to Herman, found undisturbed 6 inches from where his head had rested. A book belonging to Mary Catherine. She was a reader. People said this about her often. She was a reader and she was going to be something fine someday. Placed carefully on the floor before she slept, the way careful children place their books so they don't fall. The book was still there. The baseball card was still there. Everything was still there. That is the physical horror of Villisca that never releases. Every ordinary object belonging to every ordinary child in those ordinary rooms was left exactly where it was, because none of them mattered. Because the person who was in those rooms was interested in nothing they contained except their sleeping occupants. In the downstairs bedroom, Inez Stillinger, 8 years old, the raised arm, documented, photographed, present in the record. She reached up in the dark. She reached towards something she could not see, and her arm, her small 8-year-old arm, was the only evidence in the entire crime scene of any living person acknowledging that something was wrong. Let me tell you about the killer. Not the speculation, not the suspects, not the legal theories, the person. The interior of the person who sat in the Moore's attic on the evening of June 9th, 1912, and smoked a cigar to its full length while a family prepared for sleep below, and then descended and performed what they descended to perform. Barker would not give you a monster. Barker never gives you a monster because Barker understood that monsters, in the conventional sense, creatures outside humanity, existing beyond the human moral framework, are comfort. They are the comfortable fiction that allows us to externalize the worst things, to say, that was not us, that was not human. That exists outside of what we are capable of imagining in ourselves. Therefore, in examining it, we are safe, we are separate, we are studying something other. Barker would give you a person who made a specific and considered decision about what they were going to do and then did it. A person with an interior, with a psychology, however warped, however distant from anything we would recognize as relatable, that led them to that attic, to that cigar, to that waiting. What did they feel in the attic? Anticipation, calm, the specific preemptive quality of someone waiting for a job to be finished. Or something richer, something that Barker would not shrink from naming, something that might be called, in its most fundamental form, a kind of pleasure. Not the pleasure of violence for its own sake, though the repeated strikes beyond necessity suggest some element of that, but the pleasure of agency, of control, of being the single point around which 8 other lives pivot, unknowingly, trustingly, in the dark. And then the mirrors, the covered mirrors, which we return to always, inevitably, the way the investigation returns to them, because this is where the person becomes something more complex than the act of violence alone would suggest. Someone who covers mirrors is someone for whom the mirrors mean something. Someone who covers them before the act, not after, is someone for whom the act itself is secondary to what the mirrors might witness. This is not purely the behavior of someone performing a ritual they do not believe in. This is the behavior of someone who believes, with total conviction, that the glass remembers, that the glass can record and retain what it sees, that leaving a mirror uncovered in a room where this is happening is leaving a witness. What does that tell us? What does it tell us? That the person in those rooms, whoever, whatever, feared being seen more than they feared being caught, that the precaution they took against their own reflection was more carefully executed than any precaution they took against physical detection. They left a cigar. They left a slab of bacon on the floor of the children's room. They made no effort to conceal their presence in the attic. They were indifferent to the physical evidence they left behind. But the mirrors were covered with precision, with care. with the attention of someone performing something that mattered deeply to them. They did not want to see themselves in the glass, in the act. What were they in their own accounting that they could not bear to look at? Understanding this is worse than fear. Understanding that the worst thing about the person in those rooms is not what they did, but what they believed about themselves while doing it, and that what they believed justified the covering of every mirror in the house, is the specific horror that does not have a legal framework, a psychological diagnosis, a comfortable container. They were not a monster. They were a person with a mirror they couldn't look in. We are all carrying something like that. Most of us just don't act on it. Most of us. The Stillinger girls. We have to go back to the Stillinger girls, because their story is where the physical horror of Villisca reaches its terminus, and because their story contains a detail that every documentary, every podcast, every true crime account of the Villisca murders mentions, and then moves past, because it is more comfortable to move past it than to stop and hold it fully. Lena Stillinger was 12. She was Mary Catherine Moore's friend. She had been at the Children's Day program. She had sung. She had clapped and been part of the specific joyful noise of a small-town summer celebration, alive in the way 12-year-olds are alive, completely and without reserve, occupying the moment entirely. She had been invited for a sleepover. Her parents had said yes. Her younger sister, Inez, had come along. In the downstairs bedroom of the Moore house, in a bed they shared as sisters would share a bed in a friend's house, both of them were killed. Lena, one blow like most of the others. Inez, also a single blow, sufficient, decisive. But then Inez's arm, the raised arm, the arm that tells us she was conscious, that she heard or sensed something, that in the darkness of the downstairs bedroom of the Moore house at some point between midnight and 2 a.m., an 8-year-old girl in a strange bed reached upward. Here is the detail that accounts do not stop on, that I am stopping on now, that Barker would stop on, because he would not allow this detail to be passed over. Inez's position, when found, showed that she had turned in the bed. She had been sleeping on her left side when the attack began. This is determinable from the wound analysis. The arm that was raised was her right arm. To raise her right arm, she would have had to turn partially onto her back, in the dark, in a strange room, without waking her sister, who was beside her. She turned. She raised her arm. She did this after whatever woke her, after whatever was in that room reached the threshold of presence that even a sleeping 8-year-old could detect. And in the darkness, she reached up toward what? The ceiling. Something she perceived above her. Something she was reaching for, or reaching toward, or instinctively reaching out to keep away. The medical examiner could not determine the sequence precisely, could not say with certainty whether the arm was raised before or during, or in the moment of, could not tell us what Inez Stillinger's last conscious perception was in the downstairs bedroom of the Moore house on the night of June 9th, 1912. We know she was 8. We know she was there because she was invited. We know she had no reason to expect anything other than an ordinary Sunday night at a friend's house. We know she reached up in the dark. That arm, that small, specific 8-year-old arm, reaching towards something in the dark of a room where everything had already gone wrong, is the image that has never left anyone who has studied this case. It will not leave you. It is the image that makes the covered mirrors and the locked doors and the cosmic frameworks and all the rest of it collapse into its simplest and most devastating truth. A child in the dark, alone, frightened, reaching out, and nothing. No one there. This is the part that was edited out, cut from every version you have ever encountered, because someone decided you could not handle the truth of what was found in that place. They were trying to be kind. I am not going to be kind. You asked for the truth. Here it is. What you just heard was only the beginning. What remains after the worst moment is not silence. It is the specific, exhausted weight of a world that has changed irreversibly and must now continue anyway. Villisca on the morning of June 10th, 1912, was not a different town from the one it had been on June 9th. The same streets, the same buildings, the same river, the same 400 residents going about their morning. but everything inside those structures, every mind, every household, had been altered in a way that it would take years to fully understand. The Stillinger family was destroyed, not metaphorically, literally. Leonard and Martha Stillinger lost both of their children in a single night at someone else's house, and the specific torture of that particular grief, that Ine and Lena had been alive and happy at a sleepover and were gone by morning, is a grief that does not have a human equivalent on the scale of ordinary loss. They sued the estate of Josiah Moore for negligence, arguing that the Moores had failed to adequately protect their daughters. The suit was unsuccessful. What they were really suing for was an explanation, which no court has ever been able to award. The Moore family estate was held in trust for years, the children having no adult survivors. The house passed through ownership. The axe was kept as evidence for a decade and then, records suggest, simply lost, not destroyed, not formally disposed of, just administratively misplaced, as things were misplaced in county evidence systems in the early 20th century with a frequency that would be unthinkable today. The original 57 crime scene photographs exist in partial form, some at the Iowa State Historical Society, some in private collections, some unaccounted for. The complete photographic record of the crime scene has never been assembled in one place. The town of Villisca changed after 1912. Population declined over the following decades, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, in the way that small Midwestern towns declined throughout the 20th century, though researchers who have examined Villisca's specific demographic history note that its decline began earlier and proceeded faster than comparable Iowa towns of similar size. Whether this is attributable to the murders, to the specific psychological residue of an event like this on a community's collective sense of safety and stability, or to the ordinary economic forces that reshuffled rural America in the mid-20th century, no researcher has been able to say definitively. What Villisca's current residents will tell you, if you visit, if you take the tour of the Moore house, if you talk to locals who have grown up in the shadow of East 2nd Street, is this: the town has never fully decided what to do with what happened there. Whether to own it, to use it as a tourist draw, to try to close it and let it heal, or to accept that some events are simply too large for a community of this size to metabolize, that they live in the presence of something unresolved, and that the unresolved thing is not just a cold case, but a question that East 2nd Street has been asking for over a century without receiving an answer. The first morning of the world after the worst thing, it looked exactly like the morning before. It was not. That is what happened to the people. Now I will tell you what happened to the record. June 10 th, December 31 st, 1912. Villisca murder investigation. Official status. June 10th, bodies discovered. Scene compromised within 3 hours of discovery. June 12th, inquest. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, no suspects named. June 14th, Pinkerton Detective James Newton Wilkerson assigned to case. July 2nd, Senator Frank Jones identified as primary suspect. Surveillance of Jones initiated. August 1912, Carl Carlson, key eyewitness, receives $2,000, recants testimony. October 1912, Jones investigation stalls. No charges filed. December 1912, Wilkerson report completed, 340 pages, classified by Iowa Governor's Office. January 1913, 17 pages removed from Wilkerson report. No documentation of who authorized removal. No documentation of where removed pages were filed. Witness, Mary Peckham, neighbor, Villisca, Iowa, speaking to Des Moines Register, September 1912. I think about those curtains every morning when I get up. Every single morning I look at that window and I think about those curtains not moving, and I think about how many mornings I'd looked over there without thinking anything at all. You don't know what you're looking at until it's too late to do anything about it. That's what they don't tell you. You just don't know. Mary Peckham lived next door to the Moore house until 1934. She never publicly discussed the case again after her September 1912 interview. Neighbors reported that she covered the window of her home that faced the Moore property sometime in 1913. She never uncovered it. The window was still covered when she sold the house in 1934. The investigation produced 3 trials involving Reverend George Washington Kelly, a preliminary hearing in 1917, a first trial resulting in a hung jury, and a second trial in 1917 also resulting in a hung jury. Kelly was acquitted. His confession, delivered at a religious revival meeting in Macksburg, Iowa on October 2, 1916, witnessed by 47 people, was detailed, specific, and included information about the crime scene that had not been made public, including the covered mirrors. He described the covered mirrors in his confession with specificity, described covering them, described why, described what he believed they would show if left uncovered. His description of why he covered them was entered into the trial record on April 14, 1917. The specific language of his explanation was ruled inadmissible by the presiding judge as not material to the legal question before the court. His exact words on this point were stricken from the official record. They are not in the trial transcript. No copy of the stricken testimony survives in any known archive. Multiple researchers have applied to access the original court documents, which are held at the Iowa State Archives. The original court documents for the 1917 Kelly trials were listed as transferred to secure storage in 1981. Their current location is recorded as Montgomery County Cold Storage Facility. Location C. Location C of the Montgomery County Cold Storage Facility does not appear in any current county record as an active storage location. The pattern. Let's go back to the pattern, because if the Villisca murders are examined in isolation, they are terrible but bounded. 8 victims, 1 location, 1 investigation, 1 century of cold case status. Examined as part of the pattern, they are something else. 1 event in a documented series whose full scope has never been officially acknowledged. The comparable cases, dates, locations, confirmed parallel elements. Colorado Springs, Colorado. September 17, 1911. The Burnham family, Burnham himself, age 44, his wife 41, their 2 daughters 16 and 13, their son 9, and a boarder 38, 6 dead, all killed in their beds between midnight and 3 a.m., all covered with bedclothes after death. 1 mirror in the house covered with cloth. Axe found on the premises. No suspect ever charged. Ellsworth, Kansas. March 3, 1912. The Dawson family, 4 members, ages unknown, all killed in beds. Mirror covered. Cigar found in outbuilding adjacent to house. 3 witnesses describe a tall male stranger seen in Ellsworth the previous evening. Stranger not identified. No suspect charged. Paola, Kansas. March 11, 1912, 8 days after Ellsworth. The Mansfield family, 2 adults, 3 children, all in beds, all covered. No mirror covering documented, but a window in the master bedroom found covered with a cloth pinned in place. An item of food, in this case a jar of preserves, found displaced from its usual location and left on the bedroom floor. No suspect charged. Monmouth, Illinois. June 1, 1912, 8 days before Villisca. The Cassaways, husband, wife, 4 children, 6 dead, axe used, mirror covered, cigar found in attic, no forced entry, no suspect charged. 6 documented cases in 9 months, across 4 states, with no coordinating investigation, no recognized pattern, no federal law enforcement capable of cross-state coordination in 1912. 6 families, 27 dead, 0 convictions. The pattern simply stopped after Villisca. After June 10, 1912, whatever was moving through the Midwest farm communities of 1911 and 1912, doing what it did in the dark, was never caught, never seen, never identified, and after Villisca, never repeated. Or if it was repeated, the cases have not been identified. There are 1, 200 cold case homicides in Iowa alone from the period 1912 to 1950 that have never been investigated with modern methods. There are 4,700 across the 6-state Midwest region. The Midwest Axe Murders Pattern Matching Project, conducted between 2012 and 2017 by a team of graduate researchers at the University of Kansas, identified 17 additional potential cases in that time period with partial pattern matches. Partial funding for the project was withdrawn in 2015. The project was terminated before completion. The 17 potential additional cases remain unresolved. The most recent documented case in the Midwest Axe Murder Pattern Analysis is dated 1918. In Galena, Illinois, the Hartley family, 5 dead, all beds covered. A mirror covering found not over a mirror but over a window. The window facing the street, the window facing out, as though whatever was inside did not want to be seen from the street, as though it had learned since Villisca that windows matter too. The last known person who claimed direct knowledge of the Villisca murders, not as a researcher, not as an investigator, but as someone present in Villisca on the night of June 9th, 1912, who may have seen something, was a woman named Edna Kritz. She was 11 years old in 1912. She was living 2 streets from the Moore house with her family. She gave her first documented interview about the case in 1962, on the 50th anniversary of the murders, to a local journalist named Paul Vanderhoff of the Villisca Review. She was 61 at the time of the interview. She gave one subsequent interview in 1974 to a researcher named Dr. Alan Park of Iowa State University. She died in 1981 at the age of 80. Edna Kritz said, in both interviews, that on the night of June 9th, 1912, she could not sleep. She had attended the Children's Day program. She had been excited in the way children are excited after public events. Sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, she could not be certain of the exact time. She was at her bedroom window looking out at the street when she saw a figure walking on East 2nd Street in the direction of the Moore house. She described the figure as tall, walking slowly, carrying what appeared to be a bag or a case, wearing a coat despite the warm June evening, not running, not hurrying, walking in her words, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and wasn't in any hurry about getting there. She watched the figure until it reached the Moore property. She watched it turn up the walk toward the Moore house. She watched it, and here the 2 interview accounts are consistent. It did not go to the front door. It went around the side of the house, toward the back, where the door did not latch properly, and then it was out of her sight. She did not tell anyone what she had seen. Not her parents that night, not the investigators who canvassed the neighborhood the following week, not the Pinkerton detective, not the court proceedings in 1917. She was 11 years old. She had seen a man walking. She had not understood at 11 that evening that she was watching someone walk toward 8 people's deaths. By the time she understood, the investigation was ongoing and she was afraid. Witness, Edna Kritz, age 61, Villisca Review interview, June 1962. I've carried it for 50 years. I used to think, if I'd told someone, if I'd said something that night or the next day or the week after, maybe it would have been different. Maybe they'd have caught whoever it was. Now I'm older and I know better. It wouldn't have made any difference. Whatever came to Villisca that night, a description of a tall man in a coat isn't going to catch something like that. Narrator RETURNS, in her second interview in 1974, Dr. Park asked Edna Kritz whether she had ever seen the figure's face. She was quiet for a long time before answering. She said, "No, not his face. But when he turned at the gate, when he turned to go around the side of the house, he paused for a moment and looked back down the street. I don't know why. I thought at the time he'd heard something, or sensed something. And he stood there a moment looking back, and then he went around the corner of the house." Dr. Park asked, "What did you think he was looking back at?" Edna Kritz said, "I don't know. There was nothing there. It was just the street, just the empty street. But he stood there looking at it the way you look at something that's looking back at you." Her last recorded words on the subject of Villisca, on the final page of Dr. Park's interview transcript, I've never looked at an empty street the same way since. Current status of the Villisca axe murder case. As of this recording. Case status, officially open. Montgomery County Cold Case Division. Number of individuals ever charged. 1. George Washington Kelly, 1917, acquitted. Number of convictions, 0. Number of confirmed victims, 8. Josiah Moore, 43. Sarah Moore, 39. Herman Moore, 11. Mary Catherine Moore, 9. Arthur Moore, 7. Paul Moore, 5. Lena Stillinger, 12. Inez Stillinger, 8. Missing from the investigative record. Wilkerson Report, pages 112-128. Kelly trial testimony, stricken from record April 14, 1917. The 17 supplementary materials requested for restriction by Thomas Hennessy, 2007-2008. The photographs taken by Carl Devaney of Des Moines in June and July 1912, referenced in Wilkerson's report. The complete physical chain of custody for the axe, which was logged into Montgomery County evidence in 1912 and cannot be located in any record after 1922. The Moore House at 508 East 2nd Street, Villisca, Iowa, is currently a privately owned historic site. Daytime tour, available. Overnight investigations, available by reservation. The house was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2019. Annual visitors, approximately 5,000. The mirror in the downstairs parlor is original to the house, period appropriate, present in the 1912 crime scene photographs. It is, as of the most recent documented inspection in 2023, intact, unbroken, and positioned to reflect the staircase. Dr. Marcus Ellery, criminologist and cold case specialist, Des Moines University, 2021. What strikes me after 30 years studying cold cases is not that Villisca was never solved. Many cases from that era were never solved. What strikes me is the specific, consistent, multi-generational pattern of suppression around particular elements of this case. The mirrors, specifically. Every time a researcher gets close to a substantial document or record related specifically to the mirror coverings, the document is unavailable, restricted, lost, or stricken. That pattern is not accident. That pattern is decision-making. And decision-making at that sustained level, across 100+ years, requires an ongoing answer to the question, what is in those records that still requires concealing? The document that should not exist but does. A single page, handwritten, filed in the Iowa State Historical Society's Montgomery County collection under a miscellaneous accession number with no listed author and no documented filing date, found by an archivist conducting a routine inventory in 2019. The page contains 14 words. 14 words, in handwriting that has not been matched to any known correspondent in the Montgomery County record, in ink dated by chemical analysis to approximately 1912. The 14 words, they are still in the mirrors, every mirror in every house that was there that night. Do not look. The house on East 2nd Street stands. The tour guide who has worked there the longest is a man in his 50s. He has been giving tour of the Moore House for 11 years. He knows every documented fact. He answers every question calmly and completely. He has heard every possible theory and has opinions about the probable guilt of several historical suspects, which he shares when asked. He is a reasonable man, a practical man. He does not do the overnight investigations. He has never said why. If you ask him, he changes the subject smoothly. The way people who have decided something is not open for discussion change subjects, not abruptly, but with a kind of gentle, practiced efficiency. He locks the house at night. He checks every room before he leaves. He checks the downstairs parlor last. He turns off the lights. He does not look at the mirror when the lights are off. He has a key. He has never given a copy of the key to anyone. When the overnight investigation groups arrive at the house in the evening for their sessions, he lets them in and then leaves. He returns in the morning to let them out. He does not ask how the night went. The investigators always want to tell him. He always says, "Write it in the logbook." He does not read the logbook. His name is not important for the purposes of this account. He told me one thing once. I had asked him a question about the mirror in the downstairs parlor, about the fabric that slides off it in the night, that is found on the floor in the mornings. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, he always replaces it. Every morning when he comes in, he picks up the fabric and puts it back. He has done this for 11 years. I asked why. He said, because I don't know what it's looking at. The house is quiet. The curtains don't move. The mirror reflects the staircase. Something in Villisca, Iowa, has been asking the same question for 112 years, and the question is not, who did this? The question is, what saw it happen? And whether it is still watching. The universe is 4.5 billion years old. The human species, this brief, fragile, occasionally extraordinary experiment in consciousness, has existed for approximately 300,000 of those years. Civilization, in any form we would recognize, accounts for perhaps 15,000. What we have built, our courts, our evidence procedures, our criminal investigations, our 112-year pursuit of the Villisca killer, is the work of eye blinks in a darkness so vast and old and indifferent that our most careful record-keeping is equivalent to a child's finger painting hung briefly on an infinite wall. The thing that was in the Moore house on the night of June 9th, 1912, whatever it was, human or otherwise, comprehensible or otherwise, operated from within a context that we have spent a century trying to reduce to a manageable story. A man with a motive, a suspect with opportunity, a crime that can be filed, tried, sentenced, closed. We need it to be this. The alternative, that what was in those rooms operated from outside the human framework entirely, that the covered mirrors were not superstition but practice, that the locked house was not a puzzle to be solved, but a message delivered in a language our forensic science was never built to read. The alternative is not frightening because it is supernatural. It is frightening because it renders the human framework insufficient. It renders our courts and our investigations and our cold case divisions not wrong, exactly, but simply not the right tools for this particular work. The darkness was in Villisca before there was a Villisca. It was there when the Meskwaki people named what moved through sleeping places and refused to write the name down. It is there in the 14 words on the undated page in the Iowa State Historical Society archive. It is there in the mirror that the fabric keeps sliding off. It was not created by the murders. The murders were its trace, the residue it left on the surface of human record, while passing through on whatever trajectory has always been its own. Human beings do not appear in that trajectory. They are encountered, briefly, incidentally, the way a current encounters a leaf and carries it briefly and deposits it somewhere and continues. The 8 people in the Moore house were present in a space that was being used for something whose purpose we cannot determine because our instruments, our investigations, our reports, our forensic photographs, our sealed archives, were designed to measure human things. And whatever this is, it is not a human thing pretending. It is something else entirely, wearing the evidence of a human act as a coat wears rain. We have not caught it. We will not catch it. It is not findable in the human sense of finding. It was here before our sense of finding existed. And yet, I return to the mirrors. I return to them at 2 a.m. as I have returned to them for months, as I will return to them for whatever time remains to me in the state of mind this case has produced and which I now accept as permanent. I return not as a researcher, not as a professional, as a person who has looked too long into a darkness that looks back, and who now lives with the knowledge that the looking is not separable from the being looked at, that the investigation and the thing being investigated have been, for some time now, the same. The covered mirrors, I understand them now. I understand what the obsession with them has cost me, what the 14 words in the archive cost the person who wrote them. What the photographs cost Carl Devaney, what the 17 pages cost whatever mind produced them, and whatever document they now exist inside in a storage location that no current record names. The cost of knowing what mirrors can hold is the cost of being unable to look into one cleanly again. Of standing in your bathroom at 2 a.m. and seeing your reflection and asking, is that me? Fully me? Only me? Or has something been added by the looking, something layered in by months of proximity to what the Morehouse still contains, something that watches from behind your own eyes in the mirror at 2 a.m. and looks more comfortable there than it should? I do not know. I check every night. I check and I cannot be certain. Ine Stillinger reached up in the dark, 8 years old, alone, frightened, in the dark of a room where something had been arranged in ways she could not have known to fear. She reached up toward what we cannot say, we will never say. The answer to that specific question died with her. She reached up, and what she found in that darkness was nothing. No hand to take hers, no voice, no rescue, just the darkness and the thing in it, and then the absence of everything. This is what the Villisca case has always been saying. In all its sealed pages and missing photographs and stricken testimony and covered mirrors, that there is a darkness which precedes us and will survive us, and which we have spent our entire civilizational history trying to name and contain and wall out with our courts and our records and our investigations and our locks. And the locks do not hold, and the records go missing, and the investigations close without answers, and the darkness continues to move through sleeping places with its own unhurried purpose, indifferent to our pursuit, indifferent to our grief. The mirrors in the Morehouse are still uncovering themselves at night, and somewhere in the dark of a town on the Nottoway River, 8 people are always still going to sleep.